Hi, I'm Mike Bird. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Early Christian History, where I do various things such as interviews, episodes, and all sorts of things ranging from theology and gender, history, Christology, you name it. This time I'm doing an interview with Dr. Louise Gosbell. Louise is the principal of Mary Andrews College, and she's an expert on the Bible and disability studies. And she's going to talk specifically on the topic of the Apostle Paul and disability. Now, maybe you haven't thought a lot about this topic, about disability and pastoral care, or maybe you haven't thought about the Apostle Paul and the subject of disability. But, think of things like, Paul having his own afflictions, possibly an eye condition. Or maybe Paul was persecuted, beat up so much that maybe he acquired a permanent injury, which meant he was unable to do a lot of things continually. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things we can talk about, and actually, we do talk about them in this discussion. So if you're interested in the subject of the Bible and disability, how to be an inclusive church with those who have a range of abilities, and particularly the Apostle Paul and disability, you're definitely going to enjoy this interview with Dr. Louise Gosbell. She's really got a wealth of wisdom on this topic, and she's been thinking about things that I guaranteed you have not yet thought about. And this is important because some of these things, are really meaningful. Like, how do we have churches where people with disabilities are not just tolerated, but actually feel included and they're valued? And what does it mean to read the Bible through this lens of disability studies? And actually, how about this? How would you classify a disability? And I think you'll find the very definition of a disability, both in the modern times and in antiquity, are very different. The way we think about disability in our own age is very different from the way they thought about it back in the ancient world, and you'll see some very surprising things come out of this. So whether you're in biblical studies, you're a grad student, or you're a pastor who have a church with a lot of people who may have various levels of enablement or various disabilities, you will definitely benefit from this interview. So I really do hope you enjoy it. Hi everyone, I'm Mike Bird. I'm talking to Louise Gosbell, the principal of Mary Andrews College, about the topic of the Apostle Paul and disability. Now, Dr. Gosbell, or if I may, Louise, since we are Australians and fairly egalitarian in our interactions with each other. Louise, I mean, first of all, I know you've written your PhD on this topic. How did you get into this topic to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So originally I did a degree in theology. I was contemplating doing an honours year as well and trying to think of a topic to write. And I can remember thinking, what can you possibly write about that 2,000 years of biblical scholars haven't already written, 1,000 times over? And at that particular point in time, my husband has a brother with Down syndrome. He was about 16, I think, at the time, and had been involved in his local church, in a Catholic church he was part of, welcoming people at the door, handing out bulletins, bringing in candles for liturgy. And a new minister actually started at his church and said to my family, to my in-laws, actually, he needs to step down from this role because I don't believe that someone with an intellectual disability can identify as a Christian and so shouldn't be allowed to represent the church in any kind of way, even if that's just welcoming people at the door or handing out bulletins. And so that was really the first time for me I thought, what is a Christian response to disability? How can someone actually genuinely believe that someone with an intellectual disability can't be a Christian, that there is an IQ prerequisite actually for faith? That I found really problematic. And at that stage, very little had been done in the space of disability and biblical studies. And so that's what I decided to write my honours thesis on. And between having children, eventually moved on to writing my PhD on that same topic of disability in the Gospels. And I think the field has come a long way in the time that I've been writing, which is really encouraging. But it was interesting in the early days just trying to get traction on that. People kept saying things like, well, disability is a 20th century concept. You can't read that back into the biblical texts. But it doesn't take you very long actually to flick through the scriptures and find references to people who are poor or blind or lame, or all of the healing stories of Jesus. But even throughout the Old Testament, you have these stories like Mephibosheth, who is someone who has this significant disability. So it's not that actually disability isn't there, or that there's nothing meaningful to say, but actually I just don't think we've stopped to ask those questions before. I think we skip over narratives about disability, or we turn them into metaphors. Oh, disability is just a metaphor for sin. This is what I've heard people say. So I think it's about disability studies at the intersection of biblical studies. It's about trying to say, actually, let's stop a little bit longer and pay a bit more attention to what these stories might be telling us about the human experience of weakness, of ability versus disability, that I think are really important for us as Christians today to be thinking about what it means for us as embodied creatures.
Well, it certainly sounds like a worthwhile topic. It's also a growing area of interest in the intersection between Bible, theology, pastoral care, and the rights for people with various abilities and the like. Well, can you give us? I mean, what does disability mean? I mean, this is based on a terminology, and these terms can mean different things to different people. Do you have an operating definition that you use for disability?
It's a tricky one. It is really hard to pin it down what we actually mean by disability. In general, I think the World Health Organization is helpful. They talk about it as being this sort of combination of personal, social, and environmental factors that mean someone is disabled in their society. So that might mean someone has a condition, so they might have a mobility impairment, they use a wheelchair, but it's not just the fact that they have something in their body that means they have to use a wheelchair that makes them have a disability. There are social factors at play as well. So that means it can be hard for someone who is a wheelchair user to access a football stadium to go and watch a game like an able-bodied person might be able to. So there are these social factors and environmental factors. Do people overlook someone with a disability and not include them in Bible study at church, for example? Are people impatient with someone who speaks slowly and butt in, talk over the top of them? So it's this sort of combination of an impairment, something that's in the body or in the mind, in combination with these social and environmental factors that make it hard to access the things in society that able-bodied people might actually take for granted. And so it's sort of a complex idea, but I think it's worth just recognising that it is more than just the body, but actually those other factors too that combine into that.
Okay, well, and that's worth knowing. It's not just the body; it's the social context. Yeah.
Yeah.
When we get into the ancient world, I mean, I'm particularly, let's say, the first century world of Jesus and the apostles and Palestine and the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, what were their thoughts on disability? Was disability a category they had, or did they just think of various illnesses and impairments? I mean, what did disability? What was its equivalent term or the meaning of that in the ancient world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. So there wasn't a word in ancient Greek or Latin that's equivalent to our word of disability. That certainly didn't exist, but there was certainly a range of terms that described different physical impairments or mental impairments. They certainly had a whole range of vocabulary that they used for that. I guess in biblical studies and in ancient studies more broadly, we talk about what's called the cultural model of disability. And that's just recognizing that different cultures have different expectations of human beings. And so what would have been considered a disabling condition actually changes from society to society and culture to culture. So we know words straight away. We read blind in the biblical text. Yep, got it. I know what that means. But there are actually other conditions that we might not automatically read as being a disabling condition because our society is different to first century Greco-Roman world. So it's about having a look at what were the expectations of the body, expectations of people within the cultural context that then might help us to understand that what kind of conditions might make someone go, actually, it's difficult for them to be able to function within their society and culture because of that condition. So some of the examples I think are helpful to think about. In the modern world, muscly men, people who work out in the gym, are often revered as having these wonderful, great bodies. That's something that we think is, handsome, attractive. In the ancient world, a very muscly body was actually looked down upon because it was connected with someone who was low status, someone who was a manual laborer. So if you were particularly muscly, you were actually, in a sense, disabled by your society by association with these low status kind of roles. Think about the place of infertility. We don't describe infertility as a disability in the modern world, but in the ancient world, it would have been incredibly disabling because the role and function of a woman was to marry, to bear children. This is your role. If you can't do that, what function do you have? So you would have been very stigmatized and marginalized by a condition like that. The flip side is that things that we consider not necessarily a disability today may have been very disabling in the ancient world. So, you and I both wear glasses. You're not wearing them at the moment, but there you go. Thank you. For us, we realize our vision is a bit low. We go and see the optometrist, we get a pair of glasses. We can actually do something about that low vision. In the ancient world, my vision would have been, it's pretty bad. So in the ancient world, to have a vision like mine would have been a very disabling condition because there's no way of doing anything about that. So the kinds of conditions we call disability now may have been different to the things that they would have understood to be disabling in the ancient world. So it means we actually have to spend a bit longer in our ancient sources, in our biblical texts, interrogating the kinds of terms that are used and asking questions about what is expected of human beings and in what way did certain conditions stop you from being able to fulfill your socially prescribed roles. And I think these are important questions, not just for disability, but actually anthropologically as well, what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a functioning member of society, and the things that might impede you or stigmatize you that stop you from actually being that functioning member of your society. So I think we need more nuanced understandings of disability from the ancient world to inform our readings of the New Testament texts. Sometimes I've read things like, and even to confess, one theologian who writes in disability studies I read said somewhere something like, all people with disability would have been marginalised in the first century. And actually, I don't think that's an accurate statement at all. What we know from our ancient sources is lots of people with disability worked in the field. We have stories about people in the military, people in politics who had disability. So I think we make these assumptions, but without actually doing that good research in our ancient sources to understand the place of disability better, we can't make those kind of sweeping statements then. And they're helpful for us as we read the stories of Jesus, as we interrogate the letters of Paul and his references to weakness and so on as well. So I think that study is important.
Yeah, I mean, I would have said, the Roman Emperor Claudius had a speech impediment.
Yeah.
So, and he seems to have got to a pretty high pinnacle. It's a bit like, the King's Speech, I guess, the Emperor's speech. I don't think he had a Geoffrey Rush there coaching him on his elocution lessons for giving Latin orations. But you mentioned...
Well, there are some interesting ancient stories about people doing things like putting stones in their mouth as they're trying to speak to get rid of a speech impairment, actually. And I think Claudius was a bit mocked, and I think his family were a bit embarrassed by his disabilities, but he certainly had them. Our ancient sources certainly talk about his disabilities.
Yeah, I think they gave him the nickname Claw, because he'd say Claudius and he'd say Claw. So, it's some funny things. But there's a whole sorts of things going on. But and this is looking at the time of Paul too, when we talk about Claudius. Now, you did mention Paul. Some people wonder, what does Athens have to do to Jerusalem? What does Paul have to do with disability? What does the Apostle Paul and his letters have to do with this topic of disability, theology, and church?
So it's a good question. I think Paul has a lot to say about the topic of weakness in particular. So although in the ancient world, they didn't have a word for disability, they certainly had the word weakness, which comes up a lot in Paul's writings, actually. And it's translated in different ways. Sometimes it is translated as illness. Sometimes that is weakness that has to do with character or even someone's faith, but it is a term that's often used in the ancient world to describe disabilities as well. It's also helpful, I guess, to recognize in the ancient world, they didn't differentiate quite so much between your weakness of character and, you know, weakness in the body. They sort of saw those things as being connected. And so to talk about weakness in the body would have an implication about your character at the same time. And I think Paul is amazing, actually, because in a culture where you would never have wanted to admit that you were weak because it does reflect on your character, to have physical weaknesses would have been seen as being character flaws. Paul embraces that language of weakness, actually. He carries it, he owns it, and he doesn't see it as something to be ashamed or embarrassed of, but he actually recognizes God's strength and God's limitlessness in comparison to human limitations. And I think there's something very powerful in that embracing of that weakness language. I think as Christians still, we revel in concepts of strength. You know, we want to embrace these ideas of the body of Christ being this strong body versus a body of us all coming together with our weaknesses. And this is, you know, more of what I think Paul has in mind in 1 Corinthians 12 and his image of the body of Christ, not all coming together in our strengths, but coming together with our strengths and our weaknesses that make us the body of Christ. So I think we want to shun and move away from admissions of weakness or powerlessness in a way that Paul just doesn't do at all. I think he embraces it because he recognizes the way that God is demonstrated through his weakness, as we know from that very powerful statement in 2 Corinthians 12.
Yeah. I mean, when you were speaking, the thought that just jumped into my mind, or the image that jumped into my mind, I don't know if you've seen this, but the other day I think it was on Twitter, I saw a picture of Jesus on the cross, and he looked like an oversized bodybuilder. I mean, the guy is buff and ripped, you know, got like a 9-pack, and he's on the cross. It's almost like a superhero quality.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, would that be his work? You know, he's a manual laborer. You know, he's a a technon, therefore he's buff from working with his hands, or is this a modern idea that the manly Jesus is completely buff and ripped? I mean, you can see how this sort of these ideas of ability and the muscular or the perfect body does impact representations of Christ in art and sculptures and that type of a thing. Because, I mean, I would say Jesus is kind of crucified into disability. His body is no longer able to function. And I mean, anyone who even survives a crucifixion, which is few and far between, your body's pretty much mangled for the rest of your life. So that was coming through my mind. But I also know there are some texts that are very prominent in the discussion of Paul and disability. One is when Paul talks about, the illness or the affliction he had when he came into Galatia. He writes with big eyes. And then he talks about the thorn in his flesh. I mean, what light do they shed on this topic of disability? Those, because I know they're the two of the key texts that people mention when they talk about Paul's possible physical impairment.
Yeah, this is interesting. I think it's an important part of a bigger discussion too around, trying to shun or downplay references to disability in some respect. Even going back to Moses, he talks about in Exodus, when he's resistant about having to go and take the message to the Hebrews, that he says, I'm slow of speech and tongue. And commentators are quick to say, oh, it's not that he has a speech impediment. It's just that he's reluctant to go and take this message. I think commentators are really fast to want to dismiss any concept that these key figures in biblical texts might have a disability, like that's somehow embarrassing or shameful. And I find it fascinating when I read commentaries on Paul and I hear that kind of approach. Oh, there's no way Paul couldn't have done all of his missionary trips if he had a disability. So they want to downplay or turn that reference of Paul having the thorn in his flesh into some kind of metaphor. So it's interesting discussions that you have amongst the commentators. So some will say, yeah, I think it's some kind of illness, but others will say, oh no, that's just the the persecution that Paul experienced. That's what he's talking about here when he's talking about his thorn in the flesh. But it is interesting, you're right. In Galatians 4, he talks about having an illness, and he says it's actually because of my illness that I came to speak to you in Galatia, which is quite an interesting statement. So the word illness there is that word for weakness. But he says, interestingly, that they could have scorned him when he came. And he's almost like he's surprised that they didn't. And the literal word there that's behind that word scorn actually means to spit at. And so some scholars have said, maybe Paul actually means this more literally. Maybe he doesn't mean that they could have scorned him. Maybe they actually mean the Galatians could have spat at him. And the reason for that is the idea that in the ancient world, someone who had epilepsy, sometimes people would spit at or spit near them as a way of kind of trying to ward off that evil sickness and disease, this kind of divine spiritual illness is the way that epilepsy was looked at. And so you would spit at people or towards people so that you didn't contract it. It was this kind of apotropic function that you would have in spitting. And so some scholars have said, oh, perhaps he has some kind of epilepsy, and that's what his illness is, if we're looking at this kind of reference here in Galatians. Others have said, you know, when Paul talks about coming in weakness and trembling, maybe that's a literal trembling that comes from a condition like epilepsy. Other people have said, as you mentioned, perhaps Paul had ongoing issues with his eyes. You know, he does say to the Galatians, chapter 6, you know, look at the large letters when I'm writing. Perhaps it was a vision thing. And he does also talk about the Galatians saying that they would tear out their eyes for Paul. So these kind of combined references, some scholars have said, well, maybe it's a vision issue. Maybe that's what his problem is here. My kind of personal view is I don't think we necessarily need to pin down the exact condition Paul might have had, but I think it helps us to think about Paul and not just dismiss these as saying, no, actually, they're not physical conditions, to actually sit with them a bit and say, well, what implications might that have for us reading Paul? And I think it helps us, again, to understand his concepts of humanity, of doing God's work, of continuing on and persevering. These weren't things that were stopping him from doing the ministry. They might have given him extra challenges that anyone with a disability would probably recognize the kinds of limitations that are in place when you have a disability to do other things that able-bodied people take for granted. But it's actually, it's no reason that would have stopped him from doing that. It might have been harder to do all of those missionary trips and travel the way he did, but certainly not impossible, I don't think. So I think it does challenge us to reread Paul, if that's the case, especially those references to weakness, you know, the fact that, you know, Paul talks about faith doesn't rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. It's not about our abilities, but God's ability to be able to work through us. And perhaps that then challenges the way that we would look at disability, the people with disability that we go to church with, that we know in our lives, instead of being quick to, you know, think that someone with a disability can't contribute in society or to our church, that actually we can rethink that what that means to be someone through whom God is actually at work, instead of being quick to write them off and to downplay what their abilities and their gifts might be able to be to the church.
Thanks, Louise. I mean, and that last point I think is particularly significant. I mean, we can talk about, you know, did Paul have, you know, periodic epilepsy? Did he have a sight impairment? Did he experience, you know, sort of injuries, ongoing injuries from persecution, you know, that type of a thing? But we also need to have an interest in, you know, how do we use Paul as a resource for thinking about disability and the way we integrate people in our own churches. I mean, if we follow the logic of Galatians 3, in Christ there's neither slave nor free, neither able nor disabled.
Yeah.
In Christ, I mean, what does it mean to follow that trajectory? So do you have any thoughts on how Paul contributes to a Christian theology of disability, and something we can take away as we think about pastoral care, both for those with disabilities and those and their carers?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I read a great article once by John Swinton, who said there's a difference between tolerance and inclusion. And tolerance means we're willing to put up with people with various abilities, but inclusion means we celebrate their presence and value their contribution. So there's a difference between tolerance and genuine inclusion. What do you think Paul contributes both to the theology and maybe the pastoral practice of a theology of disability and pastoral care?
Mm. I think that you can't go past, the image of the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians 12 as an incredible model for what the church looks like. I think that language of, a belonging we talk about a lot in disability studies and disability theology as well. So it is one thing to say, we are the church over here and we will allow you to come into our midst. You have a disability, but suppose we'll come and let you in. You can't necessarily access all of the functions of our church. You might not be able to get to a Bible study group, but I suppose we'll kind of tolerate you, versus that idea of fully integrated, a participating member of a church community. And that's beyond just kind of ticking a box. So I think that's really important for us as we think about disability inclusion and belonging of people with disabilities. And I do think that image of the body of Christ is really valuable, because I think what we do is often say, like, we are the body of Christ and we're letting people in or not letting people in, like we're gatekeepers, for the body of Christ imagery. That's not what Paul says at all. He says, you are the body of Christ. As a believer, you are automatically in the body of Christ. But I don't think our churches necessarily always reflect the realities, the fact of that body of Christ image that Paul says. So we do become these gatekeepers. Sorry, it's too much hassle for you to come with your child with a disability each week because they're too noisy. Can't you find a church that specializes in disability? I can't tell you how many times I've heard that statement. Or why would we put in a ramp just for one person with a disability? We see it as a hassle, as a pain, rather than seeing this as actually a set of stairs is only used by a certain percentage of people. A ramp is used by everyone. So rather than seeing a ramp as for one person, it's a ramp actually gives you access for everyone. And I think the body of Christ challenges us to think about everyone having a place and everyone having a role to play. I love the idea of the interconnectedness of all of the members of the body of Christ that Paul talks about. And this mutuality, we're actually indebted and interconnected to each one of the members. So we each use our gifts in service to God and to one another. And so we want to be able to encourage all believers who have been given gifts to be able to use those gifts in service to God. So I think that idea of the body is important, but Paul also talks about those who are deemed weak actually should be given a place of honor, is what he talks about in the body of Christ. That should be something that's really challenging for us as Christians. Is this what we do? Are we giving a place of honor to those who are overlooked, neglected, forgotten in our society? Or are we actually just replicating what the world do here? And that I find a really uncomfortable concept in some of the things that I've seen in churches over the years. Some churches do that fantastically well, but other churches don't. I think they see, they reflect what they see in the world. And this is another reason why I think disability theology is so important, because most theological colleges aren't talking about disability. Most commentators aren't talking about disability. So the ministers who get up and preach, where are they learning about disability? All they're learning it from is the world around them, not actually a theologically grounded concept of disability. How can you care for a family who's had a child with a disability? How do you support someone who's had an accident and ended up with quadriplegia if you've never spent that time to think through a theology of disability or a theology of anthropology that includes the human experience of disability? So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there between our theology and our practice, and it means we don't know actually how to bring our theology into dialogue with the experiences of people with disability in our churches. So I'd love to say theological colleges should have this on their radar. It should be on their agenda. And hopefully that will have a greater impact on what's happening in the ground in churches. But I think the power of the gospel message is one of inclusion. This is an inclusive message for all people. And so wanting to not just overlook someone because they speak slowly or they're a little bit socially awkward and they stand too close to someone because they might be on the autism spectrum or whatever it might be, to actually embrace that image of the body of Christ as recognizing all people as valued and having a key place within that body of Christ. So actually wanting to use that image that Paul has as a blueprint for the way we do practice in our churches today.
Yeah, that's true. That's a wonderful thought. Thank you for sharing that with us, Louise. To finish off, I'll ask you, what's the one thing you wish a new pastor going into a church knew about disability? And secondly, what's the number one thing you'd read people to read for about theology and disability? So do you have,
Mm,
here's the number one thing I want you to know, and here's the number one thing I want you to read?
yeah, great. The number one thing I would say is the stats are currently 18% of Australians live with some kind of a disability. That's almost 1 in 5. As we think about our congregations, is that represented in our church communities? Stats we have sort of indicate that that's not the case. We don't have 1 in 5 people in our churches with disabilities. So what are we doing or not doing that means people with disabilities aren't comfortable at our church communities? The other studies that basically every single person will go through their life and at some point will end up with some kind of a disability. So you're inevitably going to interact with people with disability. So it's not a marginal issue. It's not this niche thing over at the side. It's inevitable that you will encounter people with disabilities. Are you ready for that? Are you prepared for it? To be able to be inclusive and do a good job on understanding the experiences of someone. So to do that, I think the text to read, I would just say anything by John Swinton, really. I would say I'm a bit of a John Swinton fangirl, so anything by John Swinton on disability. He has some great stuff on dementia, on mental illness as well. But he's really, he's quite user-friendly, I think, and just incredible in helping and challenging us to think through what it means for us to create inclusive communities.
Okay. Now, you've also written on this topic. What was your PhD thesis on, Louise?
Yeah, so my PhD thesis is on disability in the Gospels. So that was published with Morsey back in 2018. I am at the moment trying to write a user-friendly version and trying to draw out some of the things that I wrote in my PhD, but in a more simple, straightforward kind of a way. And I have also just written a handbook on disability inclusion for the Sydney Diocese of the Anglican Church. So that's going to be rolled out into churches later this year. It is up on the Sydney Diocese website, but it'll be officially launched later in the year. And I wrote that in connection with the diocese as a way of just trying to help people get started. You know, where do I start in thinking about including people with disability in churches? So it's not an exhaustive handbook, but it's meant to be a starting point on trying to think through some of the basic issues that might make a difference for, including families with disability.
Yeah. Well, Louise, I'll definitely put the links to your book and to the website in the section below the YouTube channel place where they do that. So that's great. Well, Louise, it has been a pleasure to talk to you. I imagine a lot of listeners would have benefited from watching and listening to you. And we wish you every blessing for the future and your tenure as the principalship at Mary Andrews College. Thank you for chatting to me. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike.